I would be delighted to take any questions that y'all have, and happy to talk to you through any of the poems in the pack or any concerns, any questions. So with that assignment, and I use this not just in patriotic poetry, but actually in all of my teaching of American literature, there's this series of tubes I've been told about called the internet that my students are so much better on than I am, somewhat frighteningly so. And so I will give them, with some guardrails, I'll say, put in Walt Whitman, put in I Hear America Singing, and are there visual representations? Are there other poets that have responded in kind to this? In some cases, there's a great example of a Whitman poem called, wait for it, America, which we think we have the only recording of Walt Whitman on a wax cylinder, which is pretty amazing. Among other things, we learned that he both had a fairly high-pitched voice and also had a discernible New York accent. And so it's a wonderful bit. It's on the Whitman archive. I recommend highly tracking it down. Or you can type in Walt Whitman Levi's into your YouTube or into, and an amazing thing happens. They took that recording of Whitman, we think from the 1880s, early 1890s, and used it as the soundtrack for a very patriotic commercial about America and also blue jeans. And so something like that, and there's so much of that stuff out there, maybe not immediately about contemporary folks, but often Amanda Gorman, Julio Alvarez have a lot of responses to their work. And that can just be a nice way for somebody to spend 10 minutes thinking about a Levi's ad. Why on earth would you try to sell blue jeans with Walt Whitman? Why would you use a poem called America as the text with which you would sell a pair of blue jeans? And the truth is, our students are so good at thinking about, well, it makes me want to buy a pair of blue jeans. It makes me feel patriotic, or the opposite. One of the things the commercial does is to have a group of their two women kissing in the scene. It's a very diverse set of Americans who are accompanying this poem. Our students are such sophisticated consumers of things like that, and they're actually as good at reading that or better than, say, a poem. And so I've had, especially for that example, I've had students come in and really have a ton to say suddenly about Walt Whitman because they came to it through a commercial. So I love those sorts of responses. I mean, sure, you could also go to essays written by poets responding to Whitman's patriotism, or to Hughes's critiques of American race relations, or Alvarez's use. And that too can be really powerful. But sometimes cultural responses to previous pieces of literature can be popular, can be straightforward, can have a sort of even social media stuff can have a sort of different way for our students to engage with the text, to come back to the text from a slightly odd or askew perspective. And so I love assignments like that. Christina asks, how do we get students of varying cultures to want to learn about America when they're raised to love the country their family came from? I think that's a fabulous question. And so one of the reasons to frame this as American poetry, that's my specialty, but I think that's an incredible opportunity. I've had students come into my classrooms and say the same thing and say, okay, can you bring me an example of not just a poem, but something patriotic or something that makes you feel that love for affection for your country, your parents' country. And it's amazing when they bring in something that is maybe literally and figuratively closer to home, that suddenly they're able to see, okay, I see something else going on that's similar in the US context, or I see something similar going on, something very different going on. Maybe that will help me to explain this. So without putting your students on the spot, I think that sort of show and tell can be really powerful. Just this week had a student from Ukraine and a student from Scotland present on Southern culture in my Southern literature class. That outside perspective is so helpful, not just for them, exposure to a different culture, different people, different form of national belonging, but also for my students who are yeah, I've never thought that Buc-ee's is a very strange part of Southern culture, especially if you're from Ukraine or Scotland. That might be something that needs some explanation. or that something about that individual cultural representation is now intelligible because somebody has drawn our attention to its difference, to its uniqueness, or something structurally that's very similar across cultures. Yeah, Amelia Ortez. So again, we just acknowledging that there's so much of this sort of poetry out there, especially increasingly poetry that might address American patriotism, not just from a celebratory mythic service or active or critical perspective, but also from an international perspective, and that can really help. Maybe from a different linguistic tradition, that can help so much to deepen our appreciation for form, for content, I think even for history too. Rebecca asks a great question. How do we celebrate American poetry, holidays, et cetera, when students don't have a positive outlook towards America? And again, I'll acknowledge that I have tenure, so it's easy for me to say this, but I think that's exactly the moment. Again, I don't want to force anybody into celebration. And I ended with those images of Colin Kaepernick of the U.S. Women's National Team intentionally, because I think asking students to participate in this uncritically isn't necessarily, or is not, my job as a college professor. What it is my job is to get them to think critically about this stuff. I think a lot of that can happen in classrooms too. Among other things, like without, putting anybody in a precarious professional position, like what is, using Benedict Anderson as an example, what happens when we sing a song together? Why might that be something we do at very specific moments in time? On certain occasions, sporting events, before major events. Often if something traumatic has happened, a war, or there is a sense suddenly of, to get students to think critically about that can maybe begin with their ambivalence about it. Maybe with their own discomfort. If they have an international perspective, that can be helpful, but also in our own experiences. I think, again, we don't want to exclude students by saying, and now we're going to talk about patriotism. Maybe start by giving that expanded definition of patriotism that, again, includes sort of like not love it or leave it, love it and learn to love it. Learn to be critical of it. Learn to be active in your service to it. Yes, you can celebrate and be mythical, but let's get beyond that. In my experience, I think students respond really well to that framing because it doesn't exclude anybody, even and especially if their outlook isn't positive. The difficulty that so many teachers, not just in Texas, but everywhere, are facing. But I think there's just some helpful sort of techniques that I would say trust the students, because I don't think that's actually that sort of blind faith. It gets to something that Rebecca said in the chat, that if we can get them back to the text, right? That it's not just blindly singing this or blindly reading this, that if they're looking at the text, if we're focusing on the text, if we're working from the text out, it's not as though Bruce Springsteen, Woody Guthrie, Catherine Lee Bates, all of these people inadvertently included in their celebrations of America and of patriotism these critique that didn't just sort of get away from them. Oops. This is interarticulated. And so if we can frame it a bit, we're looking at a very famous patriotic poem. We're looking at a very famous patriotic song, and not just rehearsing it blindly. As Beck said, we're actually going to get back to the text. I think that tends to give us some, if we need it, protection, that we're really looking at how does this literary text mean? How does it signify? What is it suggesting here? And since very few poems that we're going to teach are going to be flat and straightforward and literal, they're going to often have depth of meaning. I think that's one technique, is to kind of keep coming back to the text, integrating obviously students' experience and responses. But why would we use this phrase? Why might Springsteen pair an anthemic chorus with these much more dour verses? Why would Catherine Lee Bates start with America the Beautiful and then end up with that discussion of liberty and law? And again, we're getting to a sense of the richness of poetry as an expressive form. And in some ways, that's not going to save us from every bit of trouble or every concern, every parent's concern. But especially if we're choosing poems like Terence Hayes, like this really remarkable body of work in Whitman, in Hughes and Alvarez, it's hard to argue with the literary merits of all that, which immediately help us to better teach the Teagues. Sorry, I said Rebecca. I meant Kathleen had said that about blinding. I think that's really helpful. Rebecca had said, thinking of critical of America as actually an act of patriotism. That's certainly what the poetry bears out. It's certainly what American literature bears out, is that there are very few completely celebratory and mythical pieces that we still care about. They tend to be ones that are a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, C, and D as well.